Hello, I'm Dr. David Chudwin, and I'm speaking to you today about episodes from my book, The Magical Decade. During 1965 to 1975, the major national trauma affecting the United States was the war in Vietnam. There was escalation under President Johnson from 1965 to 68, and a failed attempt at Vietnamization by President Nixon in 1969 to 1974, and withdrawal of U.S. troops under President Ford from Vietnam in April 1975. The Vietnam War sparked protests by many Americans, mainly young people. The teach-in at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, my alma mater, in March 1965 was one of the first mass protests against U.S. involvement in the war. My first experience covering national demonstrations against the Vietnam War was during the November 1969 moratorium march on Washington. I joined a half dozen reporters from the Michigan Daily to cover the protests. There was a dramatic march against death beginning on Thursday night, November 13th. Marchers carried candles and signs with the names of individual war casualties, walked single file from Arlington National Cemetery to the White House and then on to the Capitol building. The marchers walked silently, grouped state by state, until near the White House. There, each protester called out the name of the dead person they represented. Their signs were then deposited in symbolic coffins at the Capitol. The solemn procession continued through the night. I covered the state of Michigan delegation for the Daily. There were estimated 12,000 Michigan marchers, many of them young, but also university professors, labor leaders, and politicians. My brush with the law was Friday the following night. I was in DuPont Circle, close to the Vietnamese embassy. The South Vietnamese regime manned the embassy, and the site was often the target of anti-war protesters. I went out to an early dinner with friends at one of the many Asian restaurants in the area. Afterwards, I caught up with a band of demonstrators heading towards the embassy. Slogans were chanted, and later some projectiles were thrown at police by a few of the militants, although the vast majority of the protesters were peaceful. I stayed clear of the troublemakers as I walked on the periphery of the crowd. Then, outnumbered police attempted to keep the protesters away from the embassy. Without warning, police shot tear gas grenades. This whitish gas hung in the air and then wafted away on the wind currents. Even though I was at the edge of the crowd and started to run away, I got a powerful whiff of tear gas. My eyes burned and watered like they never had before. I started coughing hard and my lungs hurt. A feeling of nausea gripped me as I tried to avoid throwing up. Running away from the fumes, I looked for a water fountain to rinse my eyes. Later, I learned that cow milk would have been more effective. The worst of the symptoms were over in a half hour. From the experience, I understood why professional protesters carried gas masks with them. My second and potentially more perilous experience occurred on May 3rd, 1971. Anger against the Vietnam War had intensified across America. I was again in Washington, D.C. for the Daily to cover the planned May Day anti-war protests designed to shut down the capital city. In the early afternoon, I was at a rally site near the imposing Department of Justice building. Phalanxes of police in riot gear surrounded the DOJ complex. Protesters gathered and started chanting anti-war slogans. The police first advanced slowly, shoving back the mainly young anti-war protesters with batons. Then an order was given, and police accelerated their advance. Groups of policemen surrounded individual demonstrators, pushing them to the ground with fists and batons if there was any resistance. They subdued the protesters and then handcuffed them with ties around their wrists. By the hundreds, they were hauled away. The police indiscriminately arrested everyone on the street in the vicinity of the DOJ. I had a daily press pass, but I knew that it would be ignored. The police were making mass arrests first and then asking questions later. I looked around and saw the Museum of Natural History about a block away. With the police headed in my direction, I quickly ran down 10th Street to the Constitution Avenue of the museum and managed to enter. I decided to transform myself into a tourist and began to study the Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton near the back entrance to the museum. I had short hair, was clean shaven, and wore a button-down shirt, unlike most of the long-haired, bearded, t-shirt-clad protesters. I was staring up at the skeleton when a few police burst into the entrance and started looking around for demonstrators. My heart was pounding as I intently studied the dinosaur skeleton. My disguise must have been pretty good because some policemen ran right by me as I tried to ignore their presence. They quickly left the building after apprehending several demonstrators. It took a few minutes for my heart to stop pounding. Over 12,000 people were indiscriminately arrested that day, including 2 of my fellow daily reporters. They were herded into enclosures hastily established at the RFK football stadium and other venues. Lawyers for the ACLU and other groups went to court to get them released. A federal judge ordered the detainees to be released unless the police had evidence of specific crimes. It was a matter of luck and the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History that I was not among them. Even today, I have a warm and fuzzy feelings when I see a T-Rex skeleton. Tune into my final video where I will talk about being present at the birth of the environmental movement in 1970.